Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today in a conversation with Joshua Mata from the Centro, Philippines, the Center for United and Progressive Workers. Joshua joins us, makes time very late in the evening, and we are very, very grateful for this, Joshua. Thank you very much. And he joins us to discuss the big topic of democracy. So with this workshop, we are opening up the conversation about the chapter on labor's relationship to democracy, tensions and contradictions, and achievements, of course. And we are really, really happy to have a prominent trade union leader from the South joining us today. To everyone, yes, please add your names right after your countries and please put it in the chat box. And if you have questions, do put those in the chat box or take notes, and then we open up shortly for questions so you can make them right after Joshua responds to the first question. So Joshua, just a general question perhaps. If you can give us some sort of an overview of what has been the role of the labor movements in overthrowing the brutal dictatorship of Marcos. And in particular, what were the tensions within the labor movement and between the labor movement and other movements which have affected the trajectory of the country ever since, including the re-election of Marcos Jr. Some of you may not know, but the son of Marcos, the very dictator that was overthrown in the 80s, is back in power and currently in power in the Philippines. So Joshua, over to you, and thanks very much for making time for this again.
Well, thanks for your question, and Lira. I think that's the only question you're going to throw tonight because it will take more than an hour to respond to those two questions already. Well, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone. And the first point, in response to the first question, so what are the how did the labor movement participate in bringing down the Marcos dictatorship? I think we can summarize the experience of the labor movement by saying that despite the fact that the Marcos dictatorship tried to dismantle the labor movement, despite the fact that it did everything to try to co-opt part of it and to oppress the other parts of it, ultimately Marcos failed to do what he wanted to do, and instead of weakening the labor movement, the poverty and the repressive policies that he actually imposed on the labor movement paved the way for the radicalization of the working class and for the development of a more militant labor movement. No? So maybe that's the way to summarize it. And it's important to note that in the process of radicalizing the working class and in creating a more militant labor movement, the martial law forced workers to be much more creative in fighting for their rights, forcing it to try to experiment with various ways of building alliances. I think that's one of the most important lessons of the martial law dictatorship period for the labor movement. There are alliances that are built around, common owners, like conglomerate-wide alliances. You have alliances that's based on industries, and you have alliances, and this is the most important point. There were alliances that's been built around particular areas, which helped coordinate more effectively the positioning and the actions of the workers. No? And in every effort, in every moment that they try to take action, despite the fact that it is completely illegal to go on strike, it's illegal to protest, it's illegal to hold assemblies during the Marcos dictatorship, workers nonetheless went on fighting, did their action, and continued to increase their confidence to the point that the labor movement was able to actually launch general strikes in particular cities. And this general strikes and all the tactics that the labor movement used was actually what paved the way for the eventual people power revolution that happened in 1986. So I guess that's a summary for the first point. No, now what are the tensions that continue to uh, be experienced by the labor movement that can be traced all the way back to the Marcos dictatorship? Well, I think there are several lessons if you look at the labor movement's experiences during the Marcos dictatorship. One of which is the fact that, yes, it created a radicalized labor movement, but it also created a situation where we saw how damaging sectarianism can be. Co-optation by the ruling class, co-optation of the workers by the ruling class is problematic, but it is also equally problematic if those who are resisting the ruling class, resisting the dictatorship, are practicing sectarianism, because that would only lead to further divisions among the working class, particularly in the labor movement, especially among the left. And that tradition of sectarianism continues to hound the progressive part of the labor movement in the Philippines, even as we speak today. Now, so that's one major lesson. Specifically, I need to mention that, for example, when one of the biggest, the most militant section of the working class during the Marcos dictatorship, the Kilusang Mayo Uno, was established, its establishment also had the seeds of its own problems, that everybody saw later on. And what is that? You see, the KMU, or the Kilusang Mayo Uno, did not start as an organization that would end up parroting the National Democratic line of the Communist Party of the Philippines. It was actually started by all the unions who were against the Marcos dictatorship, those who resisted efforts of Marcos to co-opt the movement. These are the unions that started to build the KMU. At that point in time, it was called the Comite para sa Mayo Uno, or Committee for May 1. Its very basic objective is to break the Marcos ban on strikes and protest actions and general assemblies. And they wanted to launch this in 1980. But by the time just before they were able to launch it publicly, the Communist Party decided that this is an interesting organization to take over. And that's how sectarianism seeped into that formation. And during the founding Congress of KMU, only those who were aligned, whose political line is aligned with the Communist Party's national democratic thinking, they were the only ones who were allowed to get into the Congress proper, and everyone else were blocked. That kind of sectarianism still haunts the labor movement today. So that's one major lesson. The other lesson that we should learn from the labor movement during the Marcos dictatorship is, just because a union can be militant, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would drop its patriarchal attitude during the Marcos years. In fact, 3 decades ago, when I joined the labor movement, it was still very, very patriarchal, and it still continues to be patriarchal today, not as much as it was during the Marcos years. So the lesson to be drawn is that if the labor movement is not able to bring in the concerns and the issues of working class women, then it would always fail to represent everyone in a very inclusive manner. So that's another lesson that we should think of. The third lesson is that, again, along the lines of inclusivity, I remember that during Marcos years, whenever there is a mass action, but whenever there is a big mobilization, some of the forces that would contribute the biggest number of warm bodies, we call it in the Philippines, would essentially be those organizations that are operating in the informal economy, what we now call the informal economy, or what we now call as the informal settlers' families, or then it was called the urban poor sector. They were the ones who would really mobilize a large number of people. But interestingly, they were never part. They were never part of the decision-making processes, nor of the very structure of the trade unions themselves, because the trade unions then were so focused on the organizations that are operating in the formal sector. So it was only after the Marcos dictatorship, learning from these mistakes, and using the idea of social movement unionism, that the Alliance of Progressive Labor, that's the precursor of Centro, my organization. It was only in 1996, now when APL was founded, that urban poor organizations and informal sector organizations became, part and parcel of the very structure of the trade union movement that we built in 1996. So those are some of the key lessons that I think would be crucial for us today. Oh, the other point is that, yes, when you push workers, when you repress them, no matter how much oppression you impose on them, sooner or later workers would fight back. But the way they would fight back would always the way they would fight back, and the comprehensiveness of their response to repression would always depend on not just on their own experiences and the political and the economic and cultural situation that they are in, but also it would have to be it's also heavily influenced by the ideas that are introduced to them by many forces, including political organizations, political parties, even NGOs and civil society organizations, at least in the Philippines. Now, for example, the best organizing techniques that were used during the Marcos dictatorship was not actually developed by the trade unionists themselves. It was actually introduced by NGOs and by civil society organizations, learning from the experiences that they saw in the U.S. for using Saul Alinsky's. I don't know if you still remember this, and Lyra, the Saul Alinsky model of 10 steps of organizing, and then that was combined with Paulo Freire's ideas and Gustavo Gutierrez ideas on liberation theology, and Paulo Freire's ideas on pedagogy of the oppressed. Now, this kind of organizing at the community level, is something that the trade unionists themselves learned from people who operated in the community level organizing, rather than and they managed to import it into the trade union movement, making trade union organizing much more resilient in a situation that there is repression. Just to give you an example, a very big strike during Marcos years would not survive unless it is fully protected by the community on where it is located. So this type of community organizing, or issue-based community organizing in the Philippines, we just simply call it CO, community organizing. That kind of organizing is what makes much more resilient trade union organizations, especially if you're looking for organizations who are willing to combat oppression.
Well, thank you very much for this really, really insightful and inspiring first remarks, Joshua. I think lots of food for thought for continuing the conversation, but let's open up. So are there questions that you have for Joshua? It's really quite excellent opportunity to get him to speak to us. So please use the time. Anyone would like to throw a first question?
Yeah, you might as well throw questions, because I might start singing and that would be the end of your day. I'll tell you.
I think, Gifford, you wanted to say something, and Comrade Wisdom might come back to you right after.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. That was very, very fascinating. I'm Gifford. I live in the U.S. And you mentioned Saul Alinsky, who began in Chicago, community organizing in the Stockyard neighborhood, but also influenced a lot of farm worker organizing, both with Latinos and also Filipinos here in California, where I live. But also it ran into some limitations because it's really dependent on a lot of funding. And it's not anti-capitalist, but not everything has to be anti-capitalist. But I was actually trained in it as a university student doing community organizing. It's really, really effective, but didn't run into any of the limitations in the Philippines that I've seen here, where, it's really structured. It's really a clearly series of steps, but also it has some limitations. Have you reached any of those limitations in organizing in the Philippines?
It's a great thing that you pointed it out, Gifford, because in the article I was starting to present, I was starting to craft, I actually dwelt on this a bit, because yes, indeed, the limitations of Saul Alinsky's model was a source of debate, which even led to which was one of the reasons why there was a split in a major organizing effort in Tondo. Tondo is like the working class community in Manila, and it has a very huge port area where the urban poor are massed up, and that's where an experimental NGO, a non-government NGO run by ecumenically run by the Catholics and the Protestants, first used CO tactics and CO organizing techniques. But then, as the movement started developing, and when the need for much more drastic and radical actions becomes much more imperative for many of the people, there was a split between those who believe that Saul Alinsky's model, obviously, which tries to deny ideology, is not the way to go forward. And in fact, those methodologies would be much more effective in a Marcos dictatorship. Under Marcos dictatorship, if it is linked to revolutionary movements. That led the split. And that split, one portion, the Catholics in particular, broke away, wanted to keep Saul Alinsky model as purely as it is, just not to let these radical ideas, not letting it be tainted by these radical ideas. And interestingly, it was the Protestant group, the Protestant bloc, that pushed this model into far more radical direction. So yes, there was that tension, and that tension continues today as well.
Thanks very much. Wisdom.
I saw Wisdom. Oh yeah, Wisdom. Go ahead, Wisdom. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Joshua, for that insight. It's quite an interesting history, and I'm actually, very, very happy to hear that. My question is based on the martial law. I want to put it this way, that in the global south, maybe it could be the opposite of the global north. When there is too much dictatorship exerted on the labor force by the government, you find that a lot of unions, they will hibernate, sort of. They will try to run away, and because of that suppression, they will not easily come out. Unlike the way Joshua is put it, because Joshua, according to his explanation, he says martial law forced labor to be more militant, but that is the opposite way in the global south. I wanted, a bit of an explanation there. How then do they, become more militant, yet there is that suppression of, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, whatsoever, because of dictatorship? I just need that explanation, Joshua. I know you you make me understand this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely get your point, your question, Wisdom. To be honest, I don't think it is proper to just say that, nobody felt frightened by the Marcos dictatorship when it was imposed. In fact, many unions were, very willing to cooperate with the Marcos dictatorship and were in fact co-opted by the Marcos dictatorship, which built the Trade Union Congress of the Philippines. So that's the main conservative labor center, which still continues to operate in the country today. It was founded by the Marcos dictatorship in 1975. So martial law was declared in 1972. There was General Order Number 5, which means no strikes, no protests, no general assemblies. But there were already unions. And remember, by the time that Marcos declared the dictatorship, the unions in the Philippines were already trying to restructure itself along one industry, one union kind of a formation, picking it up from the US. We are a colony of the US. So, we have this illness of copying everything that the colonial center is doing. So we tried to do that. We failed. I mean, the labor movement was failing, but then Marcos came in, shut down everything, and then said, you can't go on strike. But that doesn't mean all workers were frightened. Of course, there were workers who were frightened. Many actually, ducked down and tried to avoid, being seen by the Marcos radar. But many also agreed to be part of the Marcos dictatorship because Marcos was very wise. The tactic he used is the classic divide and rule. He made sure that moderate union leaders that he know of, he tried to co-opt them by offering them many things, including, for example, at one point in time, the second president of Quito Mendoza, he became the second president of the Trade Union Congress of the Philippines. He was offered twice, to be the Secretary of Labor, twice, and he rejected it, wisely, if you think about it. And then he rejected it because his idea was much more, his strategic thinking was that, okay, if I join the Marcos dictatorship, then I'll be duty bound to follow whatever it is that Marcos is saying. But, if I use my position of, critical collaboration with him, then I can, I can curry more, like milk him for whatever favor that they needed. And he had a very simple favor at one point in time. Grant us a law that will allow us to own the land, a piece of land in Cebu City. And Marcos, indeed, because he rejected the offer of being Secretary of Labor, Marcos came out with a law because he can't come up with dictatorship. He's a dictator. He just comes up with a presidential decrees. He came up with a law saying, this land is yours, provided you pay for it with just 1 peso. So that was the UCP. People were co-opted, but then not everyone would agree to be co-opted. In fact, as I said, even if there was a ban on strikes and pickets, workers continued to fight only creatively. My own organization, I come from the hotel unions. My own organization continued to fight despite the Marcos dictatorship. And when they wanted to take action because they cannot go on strike, they did it creatively. Sometimes they would all the men, men and women, they will shave their heads. And the thinking is that, okay, let's shave our heads and then we continue serving the tourists. And obviously the tourists will ask, so why are you all shaven? And then that's their opportunity to tell the tourists and their customers what their problems are. So very creative way of, airing their grievances. They sit down strikes and to the point that when Imelda Marcos, and when the Marcoses wanted to host the IMF World Bank conference in Manila in 1975, my base organization, the hotel unions, they actually threatened to hold an industry strike. All hotels, 5-star hotels that were being built at that point in time were almost all organized. They said all of these hotels will shut down the moment the international delegates come in. So Imelda Marcos herself had to deal with them. And this is the height of the Marcos dictatorship. So there is that fight. And as I said, meaningful fights, small victories actually creates more confidence for workers, and which then emboldens them to take on bigger fights, and to the point that eventually by 1978, workers were already launching general strikes. That's how we build capacity. We make sure that people start having confidence in their collective capacities. So I hope I answered your question, Wisdom. And I like your name, by the way.
Thank you very much. We have Jacania, please, and then Ian, we come right back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joshua, for the presentation. It's my corporate Mozambique was also checking. It's because of the level of development.
Comrade, we are having troubles hearing you. You are breaking. Can you please type? Comrade, can you please? You're breaking. It's really not possible to hear you. Put it in the chat box, please.
Okay.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry for that. Ian, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Good day. I was wondering, with the Philippines being a major manufacturing hub, how has, for instance, globalization impact the struggle when it comes to democracy during the Marcos period, as well as were there any steps taken to seek alliance with unions overseas to assist in the fight?
Fantastic questions. I was hoping that someone would actually raise those questions. So thank you very much, comrade. Let me answer the last question. It was imperative. It is imperative for everyone to know that the labor movement in the Philippines would not have survived the Marcos dictatorship had it not received generous support from the unions, particularly in the global north. All the unions that survived, that operated during the Marcos dictatorship, enjoyed some form of solidarity support. Even the conservatives. For example, the TUCP was able to, which is a very conservative union, but it managed to build itself up into a more sustainable union with the help of the Americans. Obviously, the AFL-CIO at that point in time, its international arm, is more inclined to support anti-communist movements. So the U.S. labor movement and the U.S. government itself, in fact, were devoting resources in order to prop up the conservative side of the labor movement. Meanwhile, Germans, the Swedes, and even the Belgians in particular, they all contributed as well in supporting unions that are aligned with their own, ideological thinking. So that was very important. But it's also important to note that at the end of the day, if you look at it more closely, all the solidarity support, while they were crucial, were also played a role in keeping the divisions, in sustaining the division among the various factions of the labor movement. So that's a tricky part about that. Now, on the question of industrialization, that's precisely why it was important for Marcos. That's one of the economic impetus for Marcos to declare the dictatorship. Remember, in 1969, Marcos managed to win an unprecedented second term. He was the first president of the country to ever win a second term. But he did so by practically bankrupting the state. So he used all the resources of the state to outmaneuver all his opponents by having the most number of guns, goons, and gold. That's the usual formula for winning an election in the country. Okay. So by the time he won at the expense of the country being bankrupt. And then, so this is 1969. By 1970s, you have the oil price, the oil crisis, and that was also the period when the global capital has been having problems with their levels of profitability. That requires a shift in making sure that labor-intensive phases of their production in the global north would be shifted to the global south. So this was also the moment where Marcos shifted the entire economic development of the country from an import substitution industrialization towards an export-oriented industrialization. The problem with that for the working class is that, and the IMF World Bank fully supported them. All throughout the Marcos dictatorship, IMF World Bank is supporting them because that was the direction. The problem for the working class, however, is that one, in order to attract foreign investors, the technocrats of Marcos believes that the best way to do it is to keep cheap labor policy. So that means real wages were actually kept at the minimum, and it hasn't been growing. It did not grow for many, many years. That's the first problem. The second problem is that, yes, there were investments, but the investments that came did not produce the kind of jobs, the number of jobs that industrial workers, the industrialization that people expect from industrialization. In fact, we did not get into industrialization. The fact of the matter is, manufacturing jobs even declined during the period of Marcos dictatorship. So you have this low wages, rising prices, high unemployment. Marcos tried to address the unemployment problem by starting the migration program, which continues to this day. When Marcos started it, he said it's going to be a temporary thing. Now it's a strategic thing for the Philippines, all right? We continue to serve. One of our biggest exports today is our own people, our own people. So, but even then, he did not manage to, he failed to stem the problems created by massive unemployment. And that is actually what led to what was one of the basis why why it was possible for workers to be radicalized. So there is that difference, in compared to the dictatorships that happened around the country, around our part of the world, particularly, for example, if you compare it with Singapore. Those are two different experiences of dictatorships.
Thanks very much, Joshua, for that. I have a question of my own, but I'll hold it because I don't want to be abusing a chair position. But let me take the question of Jaconia. It's in the chat box. I like the discussion on inclusivity, but wanted to check the involvement of student unions, organizations in the worker struggle and in the broader democracy struggle in the Philippines. And perhaps together with that, Joshua, there is also a comment by our comrade Isis in Peru about how were the workplace demands linked to the broader demands for democracy. So how was labor able to make those articulations? Thank you.
Well, interestingly, those two questions are actually interlinked. The answers to them are interlinked because for us in the Philippines, even today, we consider the youth, the level of youth activism as a barometer of what's going to happen in the labor movement, in the peasant movement, in the women's movement years from now. If you have a healthy student activism, if you have a healthy youth movement today, you would most likely expect that you would have a much more number of fresh organizers, fresh leaders, young blood getting into your various movements, which can then provide, provide leadership and sustainability. So that has always been very important for us, the health of the youth movement. Having said that, when Marcos declared martial law, by the time Marcos declared martial in 1972, there was already a very, very vibrant, very, very robust youth movement in the Philippines. Now, those who were influenced by the national democratic tendencies of the Communist Party, those who were influenced by social democracy, those who were influenced by some form of anarchism, those who were influenced by socialists, name it, we had it. So there was a very, very strong movement of youth movement that launched a first quarter storm in 1970. So this is one of the biggest student protests, a series of student protests that eventually workers would join later on. So all this educated an entire generation of our youth who then went into communities, into farmlands, into factories, who worked with the farmers, worked with the peasants, worked with the workers, and started learning from them, and that's how they started organizing them. It did not help that when Marcos declared martial law, he shut down all the schools. That forced all the students now to go back to their provinces. Well, then that gave them the opportunity to spread the idea of let's build organizations against the dictatorship. So the student movement, to answer the second question, the student activists were the ones who contributed a lot in radicalizing the thinking of the working class at that point in time. So that was that contributed to the linking of bread and butter issues of workers in the factory with those in the broader society. The other contribution could be attributed to what I mentioned earlier. The NGOs, the political movements, the political parties, both above ground and underground political parties, the revolutionary organizations. These are the ones who, even the church itself, they all provided workers' education. Now, and in this workers' education, coming from Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the press, the starting point of all workers' education then was an analysis of the situation of the working class and how it is and how their issues are linked to the broader structural problems of the country. And that makes it important for them. So because we believe that it's important for them to understand that workers' issues must be linked to structural issues, which then led to a much broader political awareness. So that's the reason why I said that the People Power Revolution in 1986 would not have happened had it not been for the spade work, the decades-long spade work of trade union organizing at the grassroots level. From small protest actions to strikes, to area-based coordinated actions, to general strikes. This all led to. You can think about it as a rising crescendo of activism that led to a broader people power revolution in 1986.
Thank you very much. There is a follow-up question to Diakonis, and I think also Fish has added to that. So Gifford, would you like to make that question so I don't need to read it?
Yeah, so just, it seems to me, looking from the outside, that movement, the People's Power movement, really sparked a wave of struggles, against dictatorships throughout Asia, because you could see the next year in South Korea, there's this massive wave of strikes, and then Chen Duan lifted the martial law. The next year, Taiwan had these massive strikes, especially on the railroads. They lifted martial law. And then even the next year, you see the movement at Tiananmen Square, where students demand democracy, that leads to a wave of workers' strikes across the country. So it seems like, maybe I hope I'm not just putting a model on something that I'm not familiar enough, but it seems like maybe the People's Power movement started movements elsewhere. Is that true?
Well, the fact of the matter is, many of the labor groups in the Philippines who are struggling against a Marcos dictatorship are closely linked to many of the groups that in these countries where there were similar situation. KCTU, before it was built, learned a number of, they themselves would admit that they learned a number of things coming from, by learning the lessons from the Philippines. We have for example, us in Centro, we'd like to believe that we contributed to the sustenance of the trade union movement in Myanmar, because when I joined the labor movement 3 decades ago, one of my first international work as part of the Hotel Workers Union is to support Free Burma Coalition. We would even sponsor Maung Maung. If you know Maung Maung, is the leader of the Myanmar trade union movement. Then they were in exile. There's no possibility for them to organize in Myanmar at that point in time. In Burma then, it was called Burma then. So whenever he's in Manila, he would want to listen, to learn lessons, even from underground organizations, because they had to operate in an underground manner as well. And so to make him safe, to make sure that he's actually having safe spaces, we would book him in our hotels and put him up in the presidential suites. So nobody can bother he's like a VIP. Then that's where he holds his underground meetings. So yes, there's always been these connections. Gifford, no, and that is also a Fish is saying that even in China, in Hong Kong, in particular, the parts of the movement have been operating in Hong Kong for quite some time, and for many decades already. So there's that close relationship with the Hong Kong trade union movement, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that also contributed to some of these ideas were actually imported into the mainland China as well, no? So yeah, it's the movements, revolutionary movements, progressive movements, national liberation movements, they've always been interconnected one way or the other.
Thank you. Any other question, comment? If not, an immediate one, I have a couple, but let me start with one, Joshua, perhaps where you were making this comparison, how under Marcos, this deterioration of wages and high unemployment kind of was a material mobilizing power for people, for workers. And fast forward to today when the son of Marcos is actually elected. It's not that, okay, the situation has changed. You could say that you don't have the same level of poverty, but I guess the inequality is astonishing in the Philippines.
Yes.
And then the real wages, as you argued in India, haven't grown in a long time. So I'm just trying to also understand, because we have a similar situation in my own country, to what extent has migration, which was not in that period, of labor mobilization, was not as widespread as it is today in the Philippines, has served to somehow ease the social tensions, because there is always this possibility of exit, but also people sending remittances home and in kind of keeping people somehow afloat. I'm just wondering, does it play a role? Because how come that labor doesn't have the same mobilizing power that it had even under very, very repressive regimes, such as, perhaps I'm wrong, you tell me, that it had under Marcos, and you have a different situation. Of course, many factors are there, a very oppressive industrial relations regime that makes it very, very difficult for trade unions to operate, and all the extrajudicial killings, but what role does migration play? This pervasive, the Philippines being actually one of the countries with the highest levels of labor migration in the world.
Well, first, let's go back to the Marcos era. The start of migration program in the Philippines is a very interesting story. The fact that at that point in time, Marcos was trying to buy oil, and nobody wants to sell oil to the Philippines. And so he sent his energy minister to Saudi Arabia. And he was trying to negotiate oil, and the royalty didn't want them, the royals didn't want to provide them with oil until such time that he realized, hang on, you need construction workers. We've got lots of construction workers. Can we have a barter? We send you construction workers, you send us oil, and that worked. That's how they started accessing oil, and Marcos realized, geez, this could work, and this would make it much more easier for us to ease the pressure, the social tensions, and all the possible social volcano that massive unemployment would do. And from that beginnings, it became a much more organized program, if you like, of exportation, human commodification, if you like. Fast forward to today, when we built APL as a social movement union in 1996, one of the key issues that we have, the key principles that we have, is that to make sure that we try to organize all types of workers, formal, informal, public, private, even migrant workers. And that's the reason why we started organizing in Hong Kong, particularly, and we have very, very clear idea of organizing the Filipino migrant domestic workers. Now, why them? Well, because they're the most vulnerable among all our migrants. They're the most vulnerable people being employed separately in all households. They need much more support. So, and this was years before we even thought of having an ILO Convention 189. So that's how we started. And I distinctly remember that how I convinced the leadership of APL to do this, because it's going to be very expensive. It's very clear it's going to be expensive going to Hong Kong, sending an organizer there. Wages are much higher there than our wages here. One organizer sent to Hong Kong would practically mean the cost of like 3 to 4 organizers in Manila. So it was a very expensive exercise. But I told them that, listen, this is important. Migration is going to grow, and because workers are able to get out of poverty, lift themselves up out of poverty, they could be a potential source of autonomous working class power. I even try to argue it that way. Being abroad, being able to escape the client-patron relationship that they're enmeshed in their own provinces, because now they can earn their own money, and then they see progressive ideas wherever they are. The trains are working, hospitals are working. Maybe that would be a good way for them to be educated about what we need, about a better society that we need. And everybody agreed. Now, fast forward to 2016, Duterte won. And that's contrary to the promise of my generation to never ever again allow a dictator to rule us. And yet Duterte won by election, all right, not by martial law, but by elections. And one of the biggest supporters of Duterte were the migrant workers. And so my leadership turned back to me and said, listen, didn't you say that we should support migrant workers because they're supposed to be a source of autonomous working class power? And I said, yes, but but the state was able to master the use of social media much more effectively than we did. So that was a long response, just to say that for us, it's important for us to organize migrant workers themselves, because first, as I continue to believe that they can be a source of autonomous power. They would not have to depend on politicians. That would break the cycle of, client-patron relationship, because one of the biggest problems in the country today is that we are being ruled by political dynasties. And political dynasties thrives solely because of poverty. So if you have migrants who are able to lift themselves out of poverty, maybe they can be free from, following the dictates of whichever political dynasty is ruling their province. So I think that's still a very important way that there is still a need to organize them. And that's the reason why, as Fish knows, Centro is one of the one of the few organizations in the Philippines that continue to really devote a lot of energies into organizing migrant workers. So, and we work very closely with IDWF. I'm sorry, I'm not so sure if I have time, but I'm interested to also mention that in relation to what Ian asked us earlier, what's the impact of globalization? Interestingly, when we kicked out the Marcos dictatorship, that was actually the time when neoliberalism was introduced in a much more drastic manner than before. Why? Because the entire neoliberal project was presented to the public as an effort to demarcosify the economy. Can you imagine? If you think about it, this ruling class, they're brilliant. They're brilliant in how to present themselves, you know. So the whole demarcosification of the economy actually meant introducing the entire gamut of neoliberal policies, no? And that's why we are now in the current rut that we are.
Yeah, I wish we could say that's inspiring, but it's not. Pretty hard. We've got about 10 minutes. Is there someone that would have a question, as we are also going to wrap up quickly? Yes, Dimka. Yes, please. Can't hear you. I think you're mute. We're trying to unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Mr. Joshua for the presentation. I want to ask, in present labor movement, because he talks about militancy during the day of pro-democracy in 15 and they achieved results. In Global South here, where we have democracy that looks like dictatorship and labor movement here, can we say that militancy, can it be an option now? And can we have any results? Because there are a lot of marginalization in the area of workers here. And just like he said, because of poverty, the ruling class are not treating the workers well. Can militancy be an option in labor movement so that we can have results? Thank you.
Joshua, did you get the question?
I'm not really sure if I got the question, but were you trying to ask Dimka if militancy would always work? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, great. No, that's actually a very good practical question. And let me refer to you a story in martial law during the martial law days. So 1972, martial law was declared, no strikes, no protest actions, no union action at all. It took us 3 years, 1975, before that ban on strike. There's still a ban on strike before workers finally went on a very, very public strike. And that's the La Tondena strike. The classic example, that's a classic story in the martial law years. No? That was the first strike that was publicly made, that was supported by that had massive support from civil society organizations, community organizations, and the church even. And here's the interesting thing about it. That strike was not instigated by any external forces. It was supported by many people outside of the trade union, but it wasn't them who decided to go on strike. In fact, many of the radical activists who were helping them was saying, are you really, really sure you want to go on strike? I mean, this is going to be deadly. This is going to be very dangerous. You can be jailed. But you know what? It was the 200 workers of La Tondena. Thank you, Eddie, for supplying that in the chat box. It was the workers themselves who decided finally that, listen, we've had enough of all these negotiations. We've had enough of all this arbitration. We've got to go on strike. What's the lesson here? I think we must be able to support workers when they finally get the courage to stand up and fight. That was a classic example of how to respect workers' capacities. Our job as organizers, our leaders, I believe, is to try to develop the capacity of all workers to have confidence in their collective power. And I think that is the biggest challenge that we have today. After 2 decades, 3 decades of neoliberalism, many of us in many of our countries, many workers have actually lost that confidence in collective capacities. That is our job today. We need to rebuild that. And the moment they say that they are ready to take the risk, no, we should all be able to support them. Does that mean we'll always win? Well, if we always win our struggles, then we would have transformed this world already, right? So unfortunately, it's not, But I am really, I continue to be hopeful that at the end of the day, you can frighten workers maybe for a few days, maybe for a few months, maybe for a few years, but you can never frighten them forever. Our job is to prepare them for that fight.
Yeah, that was inspiring. So thank you very much, Comrade, for that. We have a hand raised by Ayode Ibrahim. There was another one that I can't remember, but perhaps we get to you. We're also approaching the end, so please make it a question that ends with a question mark. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening to every location that participated in this call. My question is, during the time of the struggle, are the worker only public workers? Because when you look at the section of worker nowadays, we have formal sector and informal sectors. And informal sector can decide on their own, depends on what the government of the day is talking about. If I thought there's an embargo on the strike or whatever, the informal sector can organize themselves and hit the streets because they don't have much. The workers, the employer or employee does not have much influence on them. But when you are talking about public workers, that one can be regulated by the government of the day that is, embedded to their salary into the structure of ministry, parastatal, and the NDA. So my question is that those days that the worker are struggling in the Philippines, are they segments of workers or they are just bunch of workers regulated by government by that particular time? Thank you.
Sorry, did I get the question right? Are you asking, so were the public sector workers in the Philippines, were they able to participate as well?
What I'm asking is that, in a summary way, what I'm asking is that when you are talking about embargo on strike, when you are talking about embargo on strike because of the martial law or something, and I was saying that we have public people that the government employ under public entity, and then we have some people that under private entity, like formal and informal sector. Do they have that kind of structure by that time, or everything is being, controlled or monitored by the government of the day?
Okay.
Is it clearer, perhaps the difference in between the industrial action of public sector workers and the other group?
The public sector worker and the private sector, is that and the informal?
Yeah. And can we get one more question, Joshua?
Sure.
Then we wrap it up.
Sure.
So, Femi, would you want to ask your question too? And then we really need to wrap up. It's 10 o'clock in the Philippines, so it's we are heavily interfering with any sorts of balance, if there was one, anyways. So, Femi, over to you. You muted.
You're muted, Femi.
Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation so far, Mr. Joshua. Based on the question that has been asked so far, I realize that the challenge we have in the global south and global north is quite different because of the mentality and the approach. Actually, we have a leadership challenge in the global south. I could recall back in 1993 during the Babangida regime in Nigeria, when there are so many strikes after the June 12 issues. And when we also have a salary when the workers, Nigeria workers then were requesting for increase in the salary. Then we have a combined bodies. That means the labor union and the student union body, which is another strong union in Nigeria, they always combine together. And anytime there is a strike, the two of them move in unionism. But today, I could see that bond has already been broken. The student body and the labor leaders and the trade union, everybody are now on their own. And that is why, even when I'm going through this chapter 3, trying to say about the issue of the Social Democratic Party being organized in order to have more influence of the union being represented in the ruling class to break their power or to reduce their influence in decision making. I realized that Nigeria tried to do such things, but because there is no trust in the leadership in the global south entirely, not only in Nigeria. Now the leadership, even when you organize strike now in Nigeria and global south, you see the most of people from the same union opposing the elected leaders. So, which is our major challenge. My whole question would be that what is a global labor university doing to say that there is more orientation for the leadership in the union, because that is where the challenge lies, and to control the formation of the union. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wouldn't dare respond. I wouldn't dare respond in behalf of GLU. That's Ed Lira's Ed Lira's territory. But I would say two things. No, two questions that were raised. First, during the martial law years, nobody had the right to strike, but people went on strike anyway. So I think that's an important lesson. Whether the public sector doesn't have the right to strike even then, but they went on strike. Some of them even went on hunger strikes, and they won. Some of them lost, but many of them won their demands. My point, the workers we workers win when we fight. When we don't fight, we certainly lose. But if we fight, there's always a possibility for us to win. So that's my first response. The second response has to do with the question of, so how do we deal with issues of trust, membership trust on the leadership? I think this is where, I think I'd like to end the conversation, because I failed to mention this. I think it's so important for us today, going back, if you look at the lessons of Marcos' dictatorship, one of the biggest reasons why we were able to sustain the fight against Marcos is because leaders were provided and membership were provided with a whole host of political education. Today, workers' education is very, very weak, even in my own country. If I compare it to the traditions that I saw when I started the labor movement 3 decades ago, I think we need to bring it back. We need a much more robust workers' education program that would allow not just leaders, but also members to understand what trade unions are really for, what is the strategy of the movement, and what is the kind of society that we all deserve. We definitely deserve a much better society, but no one will hand over a better society unless to us, and it's all up to us to fight for it. And the only way to do that is for us to build unions that are strong, that are independent from any powers that be, from the government, from political parties, whose only loyalty is basically to the interest of the working class.
Well, thank you very much, Joshua, really, for an excellent presentation and insights and responses. And if I may add to what you said, and of course, it is our collective effort to also contribute to the process of democratizing unions through the political education, because we know that the struggle for democracy will be never complete. Well, it will be always incomplete if the unions themselves are not spaces where workers and members can experience democracy. Because it's only then that when one has those glimpses of experiences that would be able to actually go and ask for broader transformations in the society. And yes, as Joshua said, political education is very, very important, Femi. I don't think anyone should be waiting from other institutions. What can they do to democratize the organizations in which we are? We are the people that have to fight for democracy and more participation within our own organization by strengthening our knowledge first and foremost. And in terms of the GLU, I guess that's our contribution, to provide these free online courses that every worker can take, and to provide opportunities of conversations with very prominent leaders such as Joshua, and people that are have put their soul and minds and sweat and blood into the labor movement, and get inspiration and learn from these conversations. So we hope, Femi, that you will take this course into your own organization and get your comrades to join and discuss the different topics that we are having here. And with that, I thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much, Joshua. It's so late, so really, really appreciate it. And we're going to meet now almost every day for the rest of the other workshops in the democracy chapter. So please stay tuned and join us for the other conversations.